the significance of the Jewish participation was that there was a subtle acceptance and a subtle despair in the Jewish people that perhaps Ahasuerus really was right, and that we now have to accept the new political reality, and that is that we now are long-term citizens of the kingdom of Persia, and we're not going anywhere. That despair is something which was the cause of the downfall of the Jewish people. This despair, that acceptance that they no longer were going to be subject to the divine intervention and the divine prophecy of redemption, is what served to weaken and perhaps even sever their bond with God Himself. And therefore, that caused, and we'll discuss in a minute the significance between the connection between the two, that caused God to face them and confront them with an existential threat. And as we'll see, and as we'll develop now in the next while, we will show how that existential threat motivated the Jewish people to re-examine their relationship with God, re-examine their acceptance and affinity to the prophetic vision of their eventual redemption, and therefore cause them to improve and ultimately entirely change, as we'll see, the nature of their relationship and belief in God.
Why would King Ahasuerus even care about Jewish people? Like, why was he concerned about the 7-year prophecy period? He ruled the world, so to speak, and the Jewish people were just a small little nation. Why would he care about Jeremiah's 7-year prophecy and try to taunt them? Like, who cares?
The answer really applies to every nation. Whether it would have been the Babylonians before them, or the Greeks after them, or the Romans, there was a determination, almost a fanatical determination, which characterized each one of those ancient kingdoms to eventually dominate the Jewish people and destroy Jerusalem.
Isn't the same Iranian thing happening now?
Possibly.
Why do they care about this little...
Possibly, but in terms of the significance, I mean, the idea that, there's Titus's arch in Rome, which says Judea Capta, the significance of what politically, geographically, in terms of even, resources, was something insignificant. It wasn't necessarily even the most strategic country. The answer is because we must conclude that the idea of a Jewish people proudly asserting its religious, political, ideological independence and lack of subservience to the dominant culture and ideal was something that stood in the way of whichever particular kingdom at that time's plans for dominance were, whether it be necessary, whether it be religious. In the case, in the case of the Greeks, where it was a question of as we discussed, it's a question of expanding philosophy and trying to dominate world thought and culture. Whether it's in the case of the Romans, which is complete conquest in terms of political subservience. In the case of the Syrians, it was probably a combination of paganism and idolatry, which they saw the temple as being the greatest opposition to. Each one of them was determined that its complete dominance could only be accomplished by the utter subjugation of the Jewish ideal. And that's something that has characterized all the kingdoms that came to dominate. In fact, seminal Jewish thinkers have often pointed out that the very definition of, we speak about 4 exiles, we speak about the Assyrian exile, the Persian exile, the Greek exile, and the Roman exile. What characterizes them is the fact that they rose against Jerusalem and either destroyed the temple, or in the case of the Persians, as we'll see, didn't allow it to be built. But that actually is almost axiomatic to be characterized as an exile of the Jewish people, is a kingdom that was motivated by the need to dominate and crush the Jewish socio-political religious identity. That's almost axiomatic.
I don't even know if this is relevant or not, but how many people are we talking about? I mean, are all the Jews happen to be congregated within the same area? I mean, if he was going to wipe them out, was it going to take him days, weeks, months, years?
Well, as we read the scroll, we see there was a very carefully orchestrated and planned, systematic scheme, whereby, yes, the Jews were very far-flung, and the simple reading of the scroll seems to say, all the countries of the king, of King Ahasuerus. But yes, there were documents that were sent to the various local rulers in every province in which the Jewish people were, and it was up to the local leader to make his plans for the Jewish annihilation. This was a very, very, very ruthlessly calculated and thoroughly planned thing. Yes, and the scroll goes into great details about this. Yes.
Have an idea of the numbers?
Of the Jewish people? Certainly millions. Certainly millions. Yes.
And this was taking place around 70 years after the destruction of the community
of the temple.
So that would be
yes.
about 500 BCE.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. Exactly right. Yeah, that's right. Now, the other opinions in the Talmud ascribe the root of the Jewish people's spiritual despair at this point to something that actually happened during the reign of the most powerful of the Assyrian kings, which was the king Nebuchadnezzar. And that is that the king Nebuchadnezzar established, I guess one would say, a mausoleum to himself, or some type of I suppose it could be called a sculpture. It's not exactly clear from the Talmud what it was, but it was a shrine to his greatness. And there was a royal edict that every nation had to pay its homage and respect to that shrine. Now, whether or not it was actually fundamentally idolatrous, or it was just a question of showing a certain amount of homage to the king, but the Talmud senses that in the attitude of the Jewish people, in their subservience and their acquiescence to King Nebuchadnezzar's demands, it smacked of the Jewish people despairing and abandoning their fierce sense of independence and cultural uniqueness. That idea that we are not exiles amongst the nation, but somehow entirely subject to and dominated by the Assyrian Babylonian ideals, was again essentially a similar idea, the Talmud says, to what would happen many years later in Ahasuerus' reign, where the Jewish people would lamely attend a banquet which was at its root there to demonstrate their meekness. Now, we're not talking about Jewish pride or Jewish strength in terms of asserting might or power. We're talking about a sense of spiritual independence, the idea of a lack of affinity with the dominant and surrounding culture, the idea that the Jewish people essentially, in their need and their existence as those who cleave to God and follow His ideals, are by definition distant and distinct from the host culture in which they're in. So, fundamentally, as we often find in the Aggadaic literature, the two Talmudic opinions are essentially really identical. It's only a question in terms of which act was the most significant in projecting the Jewish people's loss of relationship with God and their sense of closeness to Him and their yearning for redemption and looking forward towards redemption, which represents fundamentally their sense of being exiles and not subservient culturally and religiously to their host country, to the host culture. If that's so, then we can now go on to explain another seemingly incongruous detail in the plot of the scroll, and that is the character Haman himself, the arch-villain in the story. Now, there's much made, especially in the Purim liturgy, about the fact that Haman was a scion of a prominent Amalek family. Now, as we know from basic scripture, Amalek is a nation which descends from Esau,